Hey everyone, and welcome to another weekly art video. I hope you're having an amazing day, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be taking you through my step-by-step process for this fall watercolor wreath. I've chosen a group of colors for this one that is inspired by the fall season, and this would be a great artwork to give away during this season in the form of a greeting card design, or you can even add a message handwritten lettering into the center of the wreath and frame it for someone as a gift. Or you can even take these botanical elements that you practice to your very own bookmark designs. I love giving little art gifts away to loved ones during this time of the year. It always seems to bring people so much joy to receive something that I've created with my own hands, so I would highly recommend. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump into this tutorial. First and foremost, I want to share the paint colors and paint mixtures that I'm going to be using for this wreath. I'm going to be using this paint palette that I've created with paint from Daniel Smith. And you by no means have to use these exact same paint colors. I'm going to be swatching these all out for you on this scrap piece of watercolor paper so that you can see what they look like on paper, and you can choose just whatever colors you have available that are most similar to these, and your wreath is going to turn out awesome. Alright, so on my mixing palette, what I am doing here is I am starting to create my cool color mixtures in one of the sides of my mixing area, and in the other side I'm going to be creating my warm color mixtures, and this is so that I can keep them separate, and it's a lot less likely that they'll be seeping into each other and mixing together, which can be an issue if I want these colors to appear bright and vibrant in my piece. If warm and cool colors or complementary colors, meaning opposites in the color wheel, start mixing together, you're going to start creating browns and grays. So I want to avoid that for this particular piece, and I would also recommend making sure that you're cleaning out your paintbrush bristles in between your use of different colors, and also keeping an eye on your container of water, and when you see it becoming murky, go ahead and change your water. That can also affect the vibrancy and the brightness of your colors. I'm also going to be preparing a couple of brown puddles on the back of the lid of my palette, which is also a larger mixing area, so that I can keep those neutrals separate from my other colors. Okay, so making my way from top to bottom here. The red puddle that you see there is plain Pyrrole Scarlet. That warm yellow puddle right there is New Gamboge with water added in. And the orange color mixture is a mixture of these two. So it's a mix of Pyrrole Scarlet and New Gamboge. In terms of my cool colors, the purple that I've created is a mixture of Ultramarine Blue and Pyrrole Scarlet. The blue color mixture is Phthalo Blue with a tiny bit of neutral tint to mute it down a little bit. And the green puddle is plain Undersea Green with water added in. I love this green for a fall color scheme because it is quite dark, quite deep. It's like an olivey green. And finally, I've also created a couple of brown puddles. One of them is a lighter brown, which is simply burnt umber with water added in. And the darker chocolatey brown is a mixture of burnt umber and a little bit of ultramarine blue. These are all the colors that I'm going to be bringing into my painting today. I'm going to do my very best not to accidentally take another red or another blue, etc., as I have to create more of these color mixtures. I'm only going to be using 2 round brushes for this fall wreath. One of them is a size 3 round and the other is a size 10 round. I'm going to go ahead and change my water so that I can get started with a clean container of water. Before we jump into our full wreath painting, I do want to share the step-by-step process for painting these 2 flowers, which are the main flowers in the wreath. These are both roses. One of them is a regular garden rose, and the other one is more of an open wild rose. So in this next segment, you're gonna see me paint these 2 so that you can jump into the full wreath with more confidence and ease and arrive at better results. I'm gonna be using different colors from the ones that I'm gonna be using in the full wreath, but the process is exactly the same. And if you feel like exploring other flowers, I'm also going to make sure to leave a couple of other tutorials where I teach you how to paint 5 easy flowers and little wildflowers that you can also practice bringing in and exploring in your own wreaths. You can find the links for those extra tutorials down below in the text section of this post. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to be using a purple that I create for myself by mixing together my Quin Rose and my French Ultramarine, but really feel free to use any rose color that you like for these exercises. Make sure though that the color mixtures that you create for yourself on your color mixing palette are nice and juicy. You want them to have a good level of color or pigmentation in them, but some water flow in them as well so that you can load up your paintbrush bristles well. You're looking for somewhere between a coffee and a milk consistency. And I have my 2 round brushes on hand for these roses. I have my size 10 round brush, which is what I'm starting with, and then I'm going to move on to using my size 14 round. So with a good amount of that purple in my paintbrush bristles, I get started with the centralmost, innermost section of that petal area. And I am using little teeny tiny C strokes that I am creating using just the tip of my paintbrush. Now these C strokes that you are creating in the very central section of the rose, they don't have to be going off or curving off in any particular direction, as long as they are meeting at a certain point. They have to connect or intersect at a certain section of that C. Continue doing more of those C strokes as you make your way out. And then the trick here is that as you make your way out, you press down the belly of your brush more and more so that those petals can look wider and wider as you make your way out. Right here, I switched on over to my larger size 14 round brush to tackle the middle petals and the outer petals that are going to be wider, that are going to be larger. Notice how as I make my way out from that central section, the petals are not only getting bigger and bigger, but also more and more irregular. And the way that I am creating this irregularity is by pressing down my paintbrush in different ways to different degrees, varying the pressure that you're exerting on your paintbrush and also doing slight wiggling and just shifting and changing the angle at which you're using your brush is going to enable you to create these very abstract irregular shapes that you want for your petals. Another thing is I want to make sure that my petals are touching, but that I'm also leaving slivers of white paper in between these shapes here and there so that at the end I don't have one single blob of color. I want to make sure that I'm incorporating that whiteness of the paper in between certain sections of my petals so that I can visually separate them out. There is some amount of strategy to this, but there's also some amount of you having to work intuitively, because the shapes that are being created as I move my paintbrush in different ways, I can't plan them perfectly. There is no way for me to know exactly what's going to happen. As I continue creating more shapes, they are going to inform my next choice, my next decision as to where I'm going to be placing the next petal, what size I want my next petal to be, and what shape I want the next petal to be. But I'm just visualizing that in a very general way, and I am totally okay with things looking a little bit differently from what I initially kind of visualized or anticipated. So it is part strategic, part intuitive for sure. Right here, while certain sections of my rose are still wet, I'm dropping in a little bit more of my purple and maybe adding in a little bit more French ultramarine into my purple mixture to get it more towards the blue-purple side, and dropping that in to add a little bit more color saturation or deepen and darken certain areas, especially that central part of the flower where the petals are overlapping most, and I just imagine more shadow to be in, and other sections just to create a little bit of color variation throughout those petals. You can do that at any point in time throughout this process, but you do have to make sure that the paint is still wet if you want to have those nice, soft, diffused out effects. All right, so I'm going to demo this once again for you. So I switched on over to my size 10 round brush for those inner petals. I loaded up my paintbrush bristles with a good amount of this pinkish purple color, And I get started with the C-strokes in the innermost section of that petal area, using just the tip of my paintbrush, especially in the innermost C-strokes, and making sure that those C's that I am creating are intersecting at some point. Again, there is no specific amount of strokes or any specific direction that you have to go in with those innermost C strokes, as long as they are touching at a certain point and you're slowly making your way out from that centralmost point. There also isn't any specific amount of strokes that you need to do with your smaller brush before changing to your larger brush. That is going to depend on the specific brush sizes that you're using and also what's most comfortable for you. I would recommend exploring the brushes that you have, maybe trying a couple of different brushes for the inner section and a couple of different brushes for the outer section, approximately in the sizes that I am using, but they don't have to be exactly the same size. And then as you continue exploring and practicing, you're going to find the specific combo of brushes that work best for you. After having created a good amount of smaller C strokes and then more irregular kind of medium-sized shapes with my smaller size 10 round brush, I then changed to my larger brush, my size 14, and I started making my way around those innermost petals, getting larger and larger each time and also more irregular with these shapes that I'm creating for the outer petals. You can see me take more paint as I go, and if I find that the color that I'm laying down is coming out way too pale, way too translucent, I add a little bit more paint into my color mixture to get it a little bit more saturated. You can see me also drop in a little bit more of a darker, more kind of bluish purple into some of these petals where I want to add in a little bit more color variation or perhaps deepen and darken certain sections. You can always do that while the paint is still wet. Make sure though that if you're going to go in to drop in more color into certain areas, that you don't go in with way too much water in your paintbrush, because if an area that you just painted is still wet and you go in with way too much water in your paintbrush bristles, that water that drips down from your paintbrush bristles can create backruns and splotchiness. Alright, so I'm going to add a little stem and a couple of leaves into this practice rose right here. So I removed all of that purple from my paintbrush bristles. I took some undersea green and I started at the base of that stem there, right under the petal area. I'm using my size 10 round brush for this, by the way, my smaller brush. And then for roses, because their leaves are kind of more wide, rounder, and shorter, I do use two separate strokes to create those leaves. You can see me right here laying down two different brush strokes side by side to create a wide leaf. I'm going to do it again right here in the opposite direction, touching just the tip of my paintbrush to that stem, bringing that out while pressing down the belly of my brush a little bit more in that middle section. And then once I'm done with one stroke, I do another stroke right beside it to widen that leaf. Right here I'm dropping in a little bit more of undersea green to darken that green a little bit more because that green was a little bit too pale on that left leaf. Alright, so that is it for the garden rose. Let's now go ahead and get started with practicing the open wild rose. So this rose is going to be so open that it actually shows the pistils in the centralmost section of that petal area. I'm going to be painting in the pistils with a dark brown that I created by mixing together burnt sienna light and neutral tint. But you can also feel free to paint in the pistils with a yellow ochre, an orange, or even a black. And I also made sure to create more of my magenta-ish or pinkish purple color that I would be using for the petals. Make sure that you have enough of your different colors that you're going to be using for the flower on hand before getting started with the painting process. Alright, so using my size 10 round brush, I am going in and getting started with the pistils right in the center of the flower. So as you can see, I use just the tip of my paintbrush, and I press down my paintbrush just a teeny tiny bit more in the outermost section or the end of that pistil. The end of the pistils have to be pointing in the direction that the flower is going to be facing towards. So in this case, this wild rose is going to be facing towards the right. Once the pistils were painted in, I removed that brown from my paintbrush bristles and I loaded up my paintbrush with my pinkish purple. I made sure that I had a good amount of that juicy color in my paintbrush bristles. And the shape that I am getting started with right now is the shape that is going to be the petal opposite to us, right behind the pistils. You can see how this shape is kind of hugging the pistil area, kind of building a little house around them, if you will. I am making sure that certain sections of this shape are touching the pistils because I don't want to leave a very obvious white outline around the pistils. That's not going to look very nice. Just like we've been making sure that our petals are slightly connected, I also make sure that this back petal is somewhat connected with the pistils. Once I finished with that back petal, it was time to start adding in the front petal, and we want this one to be nice and big. But I'm making sure that this shape is very irregular, very abstract. So I once again loaded up my paintbrush bristles, made sure that I had a good amount of color in my paintbrush bristles, and I went in and really played with the angle that I'm using my paintbrush at, and also with pressing down the belly of my paintbrush in different ways, and also slightly wiggling my paintbrush, because all of these things in combination help me create that large, abstract, irregular shape that I wanted. Now, as you saw for both the back petal and the front petal, I started at one of the ends with the more narrow, kind of tapered section of the shape, and then I made my way towards the widest section in the middle of that shape, and then I went back to the other end, which was tapered again. After creating those two petals, I am now getting started with adding in more petals on either side of these two. So first I got started with adding in a couple of petals on either side of that farthest petal that is behind the pistil area that we started with. And once those were in, I started adding a couple of petals on either side of the larger petal shape that we just painted closest to us. And again, where I want that petal shape to be more narrow, more tapered, I'm touching just the tip of my paintbrush, and where I want that petal shape to be wider, I press down my paintbrush a little bit more. And if I want that shape to become more narrow again, I lift up my paintbrush more. It's all about changing and shifting the amount of pressure that you're exerting on your paintbrush and visualizing the shape that you'll be creating by altering the pressure that you're exerting on your paintbrush. As much as possible, I want to create that shape using one single stroke. However, if I find that I don't like the shape or I want to modify it after having created it, that's perfectly okay. I just try to go in and do minimal changing if I have to. As I am painting in both of these quote-unquote sets or pairs of petals that I am adding in on either side of these first two petals that we started with, I want to make sure that I'm not making things way too symmetrical. I want to make sure that there are slight differences between these petals that I am adding in on either side in order to stay away from things looking way too patterny, way too organized, way too stiff. And if after finishing with this kind of strategy that I walked you through, if you want to add in an extra petal on either side or at the back or something, because you feel things will look a little bit more asymmetrical, more natural, or more balanced, go ahead and add in an extra petal. All right, so I finished up with 3 more petals, one farthest away from us, just created a little shape back there, and then a couple more petals just to add a little bit more volume to this flower. Notice the irregularity present all throughout here. Just finishing up with a little stem here, starting with a little V shape right at the base of the stem, right under the petal area. And then I made my way down with a very thin line using just the tip of my paintbrush. I'm going to be working on 140 pounds or 300 GSM cold press watercolor paper. It's this paper right here. Let me show you. Ready cut watercolor paper from Strathmore. Step number 1, especially if you're just getting started with drawing and painting, is I would recommend grabbing some sort of circular object that you can trace around. Make sure that the circular object that you pick is a good size when you compare it and place it on the watercolor sheet that you're going to be working on. You don't want it to be too small or too big. Essentially, you want to make sure that you have a good amount of space both inside the circle and outside the circle. And another huge tip is make sure that you trace over it super, super lightly. I don't want my pencil lines to show through my paint at the end. Because watercolor is translucent, it's transparent, you're gonna be able to see through it and you're gonna see your pencil lines if you trace too hard or too dark. By having this circle on our page, it's gonna be much more easy to visualize where we have to place our different elements and especially the largest flowers so that we end up with a circular wreath at the end. I'm gonna very lightly trace over or around this lid. All right, so hopefully you can see a very faint circle on my page, and I'm gonna use my kneaded eraser, gently tap it over my circle, and I'm gonna make it even lighter. I just wanna be able to barely see it on the page because the circle is just for me. No one else is meant to see it. All right, so you can barely see it on screen right now. I can see it just enough so that I can get on with the process. Now that I'm all set, I'm gonna start with my first flower, which is gonna be my largest rose in this section of my circle. I'm gonna create the purple that I want right here on my palette, create a nice juicy puddle of color. And this is ultramarine blue and pyrrole scarlet that I am using to create my purple, which I will be adding more red into this mixture as I make my way out into those exterior petals so that I can have a change in hue throughout the petals. And I'm gonna start creating the center of my rose right on my pencil line that you can barely see. But I'm gonna start right there, right on the pencil line. I'm gonna start with my C strokes and make my way out. Stay loose. Remember to leave some space between your petals, but not so much that they look detached, like they're not part of the same flower. And I'm pressing the belly of my brush a little bit more onto the paper as I make my way out. Taking a little bit more of my red so that I can get it a little bit more towards the red-purple side. And I continue adding more petals. I need a little bit more water. Taking some water from my container, swiveling in my mixture. I noticed that my color mixture was not as juicy as I wanted it to be. A little bit more paint as I make my way out. Add a little bit of paint into the center of the flower to get it darker. And I'm almost done here. This is going to be the largest flower that I'm going to be adding, so just want to make sure that I add enough petals, but not so many that I just make it super huge. Too huge. I'm all done with this first rose. I'm gonna rinse out all of this purple from my paintbrush. And I am now going to get started with a wild rose. I want the wild rose to be pointing towards the left in that direction. So this means that the pistils have to be pointing towards that direction. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use my size 3 round brush. I'm gonna take some of this darker brown that I created by mixing together my burnt umber and ultramarine blue. And I wanna start creating these pistils somewhat near this rose because I do want this rose to overlap the back part of the second rose, but not too close that I'm not gonna be able to paint enough petals and make this look like a wild rose. These are the pistils. I cleaned my size 3 round brush and set it off to the side, and I switched on back to my size 10. I want to make this wild rose yellow orange. So I take a good amount of this orange color mixture that I created by mixing together New Gamboge and Pyrrole Scarlet. And for the wild rose, I do like churning my page because I'm painting very specific petal shapes. So the first shape is a little house around the pistils. Kind of go like that. You can touch the pistils there so that you don't leave a huge empty space around the pistils. So that's the first petal behind the pistils. Now I'm going to paint the petal below that. For this one, if you watch the video, it's kind of more narrow along the sides, then it gets large at the bottom, then it gets narrow again, curving up a little, kind of like that. I'm gonna add a little bit more New Gamboge into my mixture, and I'm gonna create 2 more petals, one here and one here. So one of these petals goes into this shape, and then the other goes into this shape like that. Grabbing a little bit more of my New Gamboge, maybe a little bit more of my red, mix it in, get a nice orange that I like. Then I'm gonna continue with these larger petals. Connect down here. And there you go. And I need maybe a little petal here, just a random little abstract shape there. And then I'm just gonna create more petals on this side. This is an open rose, so this is why these petals are creating a little bit more of an open effect. Okay, so there is my first wild rose. Now, if you want to drop in a little bit of an extra dark color while it's still wet to darken certain sections, I would just recommend that you do it while the paint is still wet. Otherwise, you can arrive at an overworked, splotchy look. Add in an extra little shape there. Cool. So we're done with our first wild rose. As I mentioned, I want another little flower over here, and I'm gonna make that a rose as well, but I'm gonna make it smaller than this one and a different color as well. So the color that I'm gonna use for this rose, maybe like a salmony pink. I'm gonna go back to my warm colors here on my palette and add quite a bit of New Gamboge into my red. I want the color to be different from the ones that I've already used. Same process that I used for this rose. I'm gonna start with the C strokes that I used to create the middle section of the flower right along my pencil line. And I'm just gonna make sure to make it smaller. So I'm not gonna expand the outer petals as much and keep on adding and adding. I want it close to the rose. Wiggle your paintbrush to get those nice, irregular, abstract shapes. Taking a little bit more red to darken my mixture and create a little bit more of a variation in hue throughout the petals. And as I get closer to the purple, large purple rose here, I'm just careful that I don't paint over the purple. Actually want to make it look like the purple rose is overlapping this one, so I have to be careful with that. have a little bit of extra water to absorb right here. So I'm just gonna remove this extra water with the bristles of my paintbrush. Use the bristles as a little absorbent sponge. Tap the bristles on your absorbent towel and you can remove the excess water like that. I'm gonna add in a little bit more of my pyrrole red into the center to darken it. I'm all done with these flowers in the bottom right. So I am now going to work on the flowers up here. I want one of these regular roses here, only slightly smaller than this one, maybe around this size right here. And then I'm gonna have a wild rose looking off to this direction. This means that if I want the wild rose to be looking that way, the pistils that I start the flower with are gonna be looking off to that direction towards the right. So it's going to be the opposite of this one, in which the pistils are looking towards the left. The rose can be any color. I'm going to make it similar to this one, perhaps a little bit more towards the red purple side, which means that I need to add some of my red into the mixture. And I think this is a good color here. You can even test your color mixtures on a scrap piece of watercolor paper so that you can ensure that they are what you need. Just like with the other two roses, I am making sure to start with those tiny C strokes right on my pencil line. So I'm taking some amount of this nice juicy reddish purple mixture here. And again, I want it to be approximately this size, maybe a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit larger, but not as large as this one. I don't want it to compete with this one. Much water. I'm just absorbing some excess water here before it dries strange. Making my way out. Leaving slivers of paper in between the petals, but also connecting them in some points. Don't overthink it. I find that the more I overthink it, the worse my flowers look. I'm gonna add a little bit more blue into my red-purple mixture. Just gonna drop it into the middle section and just along some little spaces here and there to create a little bit of a variation in hue and value in the petals. I'm gonna remove this paint from my paintbrush bristles and I'm gonna get started with the wild rose. So back to my size 3 round brush and back to my dark brown color mixture that I created by mixing together ultramarine blue and burnt umber. Just gonna take a little bit of this dark brown paint, and as I said, I want this wild rose to be pointing towards the right. So this means that the pistils have to be opposite to these. Turn your paper around if it's more helpful. It definitely is for me. And you want this wild rose to be separate from this rose. Give it enough space, but don't paint it so far away that these will look too far apart. You want to make them look like they are touching. Okay, so those are the pistils. Clean my size 3 round brush. Set it off to the side, preparing my size 10. I'm gonna make more of my orange color mixture. I want to create a color that's similar to this one. And I'm gonna start with the shape that is kind of hugging or wrapping around the pistils. Nice, irregular, abstract shape, skinny at the bottom, and then more tall and irregular above the pistils. I'm gonna turn my paper around this way. Gonna paint the 2 petals inside here. 2 long petals outside, a big extra petal here at the bottom, big irregular shape, and then a couple extra petals at the top. You can see how close I came to the edge of my paper here. This is why it's so important to create that circle in the beginning so that you can make sure that you're positioning things in a way that not only will it look like a circle, like a wreath at the end, but also so that your flowers don't end up being way too large and end up being cropped out of the page. The most important flowers have been added in at this point. I'm going to be adding in a couple of extra little flower bulbs. These are smaller flowers that are going to be just starting to open. I'm going to add one here, one maybe over here. I'm gonna make this one yellow, and I just flipped my page again, adding a little bit more new gamboge. These little bulbs are way easier. Very similar to the tulip that I share with you in a past 5 easy flowers tutorial. It's just a little whoop, center petal, then you go another petal, and that's a little bulb. Then if you want to add in an extra little shape, you can do that. So that's one little flower bulb right there. I'm gonna add another one here coming up, and I'm gonna make that one red. And then I'm gonna do the same thing, only in the opposite direction. So central little petal, then whoop and whoop. And then you can add an extra petal, kind of like that. All right, so we have our 2 major sections for our wreath in, and we're now going to continue with little twigs and leaves and berries. So I'm gonna switch on back to my size 3 round brush, make sure it's a little bit damp, and I'm gonna take a little bit more of my dark brown. I can still see my pencil circle here and here. I'm gonna use those lines to visualize where to draw the twigs. I'm not trying to create a smooth curve for my twig, but I'm gonna use it as a guide so that I can make sure that the twigs visually create that circle at the end. So I'm gonna start here, and so this upper section here, I started with the circle with the pencil, and then so for that little section that is nearest the flower, I did start using the circle that I created with pencil, and then I just went off and out from there, creating an irregular twig. I'm gonna do the same thing, but going up from here. Make sure that you create very irregular twigs. These are organic, natural things that you're painting here, so you want a lot of imperfection and irregularity. I'm gonna make another one here. I have another video in which I share must-do exercises for beginners, which will help you practice your water and your brush control, where I show you how to do those upwards flicks so that your thin lines taper at the end, and that exercise can really help you with your twigs. I'll make sure to link to that one down below as well. Okay, so I think those are enough twigs for that side. Let me move on to this section over here. Flipping my paper over again because it's more comfortable for me to work like this. Taking a little bit more of my dark brown. I'm gonna do the same over here. Using my circle that I created with pencil, but not really trying to use it to create a perfect smooth curve twig or anything like that. Just using it to visualize that general circle shape so that I don't go way off the board. Maybe I add in extra twigs coming out of some sections. So flipping on back. Maybe here I want to add in an extra twig. Coming in. All right, so now with the twigs in, we can visualize that circle a lot more easily, and it's now time to start placing leaves and berries back to my size 10 round brush. And now we're gonna be using greens and blues, reactivating my undersea green here. And these leaves are really gonna start giving this wreath its fullness. I'm gonna start by adding leaves along or around the main flowers here, and then I'll add some smaller ones in these areas. So I start with my undersea green, gonna add in a leaf here. Sometimes I make leaves with one single stroke and sometimes with two. It depends how thick I want those leaves to be or how rounded. I add in new gamboge, which is the yellow that I'm using to lighten the green if I want to make it lighter. And another way that I can create a different green for that variety that I've been talking about is by adding some of my phthalo blue so that we can have variety in hue even in the leaves. You can always absorb excess water with your paintbrush bristles if you have to, and use your absorbent towel to do some dabbing. I'm gonna add a little bit of my blue, phthalo blue. Get this leaf a little bit darker. In some sections, just drop it in while that green is still wet. Trying to make sure that the color mixtures that I am using are nice and juicy, that I'm not going too dry. Larger leaves around the flowers. Trying to stay away from pairs of leaves. And sometimes I'm adding in yellow, sometimes I'm adding in blue, sometimes I'm just using my green for that variety. All right, I'm gonna add more leaves on the opposite side. Maybe I wanna create 2 leaves here. Variety, irregularity, all of those things are key. Smudged my paint a little down here. I need to clean that up just a bit. Light leaves here. That green had a lot of new gamboge in it, as you can see. Got that variety in. Let me clean up this little smudge. All I did there was I went in to do some gentle scrubbing with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush, and I can just leave that to dry and then paint that in a little bit with my green that I was using to make that little splotch less noticeable. That's okay. Doing a little bit of lifting here, add a little bit more dimension into these leaves. Look a little bit too dark. Okay, let's see, maybe a couple more leaves over here. Undersea green. I'm gonna fix this little splotch. There we go. All right, so I think those are enough kind of major, larger leaves around the flowers. I may add in more later, I'll see. But for now, I want to add in smaller leaves in these areas right here with just one single short stroke. And you can use any of your greens. You can use your lighter green that has the yellow mixed in, the plain base green, whatever base green you're using, or you can use your base green with the blue that you're using as a blue green. Still using my size 10 round brush. Go ahead and start. Pay attention to the direction of your twigs. If your twigs are going in that direction, you want to make sure that you are laying down your leaves in a way that makes sense with that, in a way that those leaves could be connected to the twig. Now, of course, some of these little leaves that I'm going to be adding in are just going to be kind of not really attached to the twig, but you do want to make sure that a lot of these leaves do make sense with that direction that you've already started painting those twigs in. So those are enough smaller leaves. I'm gonna be adding some longer leaves, and these are not going to be attached to the twigs in any way. Just kind of long, grassy strokes. I'm gonna use some of my lighter green that I created with my new gamboge. And these are long strokes that I'm creating with my size 3 round brush. So adding fullness here. This is just filler. It's gonna help add fullness to the wreath. So we're almost done. I don't want to go overboard and start adding in way too much. I do want to add in some blue berries. So I'm still going to use my size 3 round brush, and I'm going to use some of my phthalo blue with a little bit of neutral tint added in just to mute it down a little. Phthalo blue is very bright. I don't want it as bright. That's why I added in a little bit of neutral tint. And you can even test it out on a scrap piece of paper. I added way too much neutral tint. A little bit more phthalo blue. There we go. That's a nice kind of indigo color. I like phthalo blue, but it's a little bit too bright. Size 3 round brush. I'm just going to add in some pops of blue, which if you like brighter blue, you don't have to add in the neutral tints. I like leaving a little teeny tiny section of white paper shining through when I paint berries so that a little highlight can provide that shiny look, rounded look to the berries. You can connect some of these berries to the twigs, or you can just make them separate, kind of floating and just creating a little bit more filler in the wreath. A big thing to painting florals, whether it's wreaths, floral arrangements, loose flowers, that kind of thing, is you're painting more intuitively, because there's only a certain amount of planning that you can do, and you have to go by what is happening on the paper and continue making decisions based on what you're seeing. So we do have to practice flowers that you're going to be adding in, understand composition a little bit so that you don't go overboard with the amount of elements. Maybe make sure that you're creating asymmetry and arriving at a balanced look. But aside from that, it is a lot about being able to work more intuitively and make decisions along the way, because not everything can be planned, and the looser the technique, the looser the look, the more you have to be okay with making decisions along the way. Adding more things where you feel it's a little bit too empty. Making things look a little bit more intentional. All right, so I'm almost done here. The very last step that I am going to do is if there's anything that I want to darken a little bit more, let's say I want to darken the pistils in the wild roses, I create a little bit more of that color, which in this case is burnt umber with ultramarine, nice chocolatey brown. Make sure you're using the appropriate paintbrush and just be very loose, don't overdo it. This is just a final little step where I'm just doing final detailing, and when we're working with watercolor, less is more, and it's very easy to start overworking things. This final step really it's optional, and if you are going to do it, just make sure that you're not going overboard. Less is more. Maybe you can add an illusion of a central vein in some of the leaves. You want to make these central veins super stark looking. I'm just going in with a tea-like consistency with whatever color mixture it is that I'm using, nice and watery and translucent. All right, and with that, I'm all done with this fall-inspired watercolor wreath. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited, they are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops, all have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!